A very good day to you, wherever you may be viewing from. My name is Fred Reynolds, an American. I'm speaking to you from the first floor of our home in Kansas City, Missouri, which is the geographical center of the United States. It's cold. There's snow on the ground outside. Myself and our puppy are quite warm. Although an American, I have lived and worked overseas over 10 years with my wife and children, often the dog also. So I have some appreciation for the many different great cultures around the world. I speak Turkish as a second language. I used to routinely fly from Istanbul to Central Europe to bid in person in stamp auctions in Switzerland and Germany, mostly unsuccessfully, I would add. As a retired U.S. Army senior leader, and also as a retired flight instructor, it is easy for me to be attracted to this most interesting and most courageous part of World War I philatelic history. By the way, my main mission today, is to make sure that I finish talking before you finish listening. Let's see if we can get that done. So here's the subtitle: World War I German Airship Combat Operations Postal History. Everything you wanted to know about World War I German airships, but were afraid to ask. So why did I make this presentation? I caught a communicable disease from Dr. Cheryl Gantz. She is the president of the American Philatelic Association, American Philatelic Society, and we've worked together in many projects. This fever is very contagious. It's not yellow fever or rheumatic fever, but the very dangerous Zeppelin fever. So here's the roadmap of today's presentation. It's pretty simple. First part is, what in the world is a Zeppelin? Then an overview of World War I combat operations focused on Zeppelins, and then some methods of how to collect this most interesting topic. Particularly when I'm giving this presentation in person to Americans who don't really know much about Zeppelins, I often start with these rhetorical questions. So they're rhetorical. I'm not expecting you to answer them. So where does the word Zeppelin come from? Is it the Greek word meaning fly like a bird, the exotic South Seas bird of the same name, or a Prussian cavalry general? Well, it's number 3. A Prussian cavalry general. And here it is, Ferdinand Adolf Heinrich August Graf von Zeppelin, who lived from 1838. He died before the end of World War I. He was a general of cavalry, of Prussian cavalry. On the left-hand side, you can see a picture of him in his cavalry garb with his saber at his side. Now, here on the right-hand side is an interesting picture when he's much younger. And I'm going to pose another question asking, where was this picture taken? Again, the rhetorical question: was it in Hartford, Connecticut, Bavaria, or Virginia in 1863? It was Virginia in the United States because he was an observer in the American Civil War. And if we were to go back to that picture, you would see 2 cavalry sabers in there, one a Prussian and one a U.S. So here's another rhetorical question. Where was his first gas balloon ride? Was it in Paris, France in 1854, London, England in 1859, or Fort Snelling, Minnesota in 1863? Well, the answer displayed on this U.S. postage, this 6-cent U.S. postage stamp, is Fort Snelling, Minnesota in 1863. The good count had had an opportunity to view some airship operations for the Army of the Potomac, the Northern Army in the American Civil War, and he saw hot air and hydrogen and inflated balloons. Fort Snelling had a professor there, and he had a balloon that was illuminated, it was fueled by illumination gas, that is methane gas that the city was using to provide lighting inside of homes and factories. And he ascended in this methane-powered balloon. And the reason we know that took place is because one of the passengers was the daughter of the governor, who recorded in her diary, which was released years later. So let's look at his timeline, not as a soldier, but with regard to airships. He retired from the Prussian army in 1891. His first design of an airship was in 1893. He copyrighted it, patented it, so that anyone that used his designs had to pay him royalties and get his permission. The first flight was LZ-1, and it was in 1900. And notice we've started a numbering system now, LZ-1, and these numbers continue with each Zeppelin craft that was built by the Zeppelin company. It was important for him as a military man to seek military support because he saw this as an engine of war. He saw some real possibility, and he had exhausted his funds, his personal funds, in building LZ-1 and some other airships that were not always completely successful, and he sought and received German military support in 1909. So let's talk a little bit about what is a Zeppelin. It's easy to think of a balloon full of helium or hydrogen. It's just a piece of rubber. But a Zeppelin is a rigid airship. Rigid meaning that it has a skeleton inside. So here's a view of this skeleton. I'm not sure which one this is, but you can see that this framework, this is made of duraluminum, and you can see from the size of the worker that this is a really mammoth aircraft. And so this framework contained the helium-containing balloons that are inside that you don't see from the outside. And the rigid airship provided some aerodynamic stability and some fins on the end so that it was easy to direct, or easier than a free balloon anyway. So here, this is a schematic of the Graf Zeppelin, which is much later. It's number 127. And you can see here the shiny silver skin that covers that skeleton we just looked at. And you can see inside in rose color the hydrogen-filled balloons that provide the buoyancy for this aircraft. You can see the fins on the end, rudder and elevators that provide the stability and steer the craft. And at the very bottom, you can see a blue line. This is a keel, just like a keel of a ship. It provides the rigidity on which all the weight-bearing parts of the ship are suspended, like gondolas and a Bombay and the engines. So this is a rigid airship. There are other types of airships. And in World War I, there were 4 types of airships that the military used, not merely Zeppelins, and we'll cover all 4 of them. So now let's talk briefly about the theater of operations. This is particularly instructive for most Americans who often don't really know much about World War I, but this depicts the Central Powers in the darker brown, and in the lighter brown, the Allied powers that were the belligerents in this horrific war. So the German Empire and the Austrian Empire allied with it had a significant problem, and that is they had to fight on 2 fronts. And eventually they had to fight on 3 fronts when Turkey was brought into the war as an ally of Austria and Germany. So there are really 3 fronts, and the Eastern Front in Russia, the Western Front in France, and the Balkan Front along the Mediterranean. And these airships were employed in all 3 fronts. It's the most noteworthy is the use of the Zeppelins in the Western Front to include raids on England, but this war engine was used in all 3 theaters of war. So now let's look at summary of combat operations. So I'm going to cover about 2.5 years of operations in one slide and hopefully in a couple minutes. First, there were pre-war expectations from 1909 to 1914, when the war started in August. There were expectations, some of them fermented by the media, some with patriotic citizens, about what some of the important engines of war would be if and when war took place. And during the same time, in the second bullet, there was quite a bit of pre-war planning and mobilization. I have a translated copy of one of the major mobilization plans for the airships. And this includes how are you going to provide the factories to generate all the hydrogen, which is moved mostly by rail car? How are you going to build all of the airfields that you have to operate from? Some of these are going to be captured airfields. How are you going to build these huge hangars to contain these things? The largest are almost 2 football fields long. And how are you going to draft the soldiers and sailors that you need? How are you going to train them? Where are you going to find the pilots? How are you going to get the engines? Tremendous industrial project. The early results were unsatisfactory, as you see in the third bullet. The use, when the war started, there were only 6 military airships. They were all Zeppelins, and very few of them survived. Most of them were damaged and destroyed through enemy action or through weather. They're very fragile devices. These unsatisfactory results encouraged the Germans to change both their equipment and their tactics. On the equipment side, they decided they had to have larger Zeppelins with more lifting capability so that they could fly much higher and they could carry more ordnance, in this case, bombs. And they changed their tactics in the same way through going to increasing heights. Originally, as they were utilized in 1914, they were flying at very low heights, 1,000 feet. And at this height, they could be destroyed or damaged by machine gun, even rifle fire, and of course, artillery fire. And then later, as the Allies and the Germans developed regular airplanes with fixed wings, they became a target. So getting to higher altitudes using larger and larger ships was a major effort of the German airship industry and the Army and the Navy. There were ships in both the German Army and ships in the German Navy. At about this time, the London raids became important. It's focused on London, but the original attacks were just on industrial sites all throughout England, wherever the airships could reach them, and particularly ports. The idea that transportation could be disrupted, ordnance and factories could be destroyed. On the eastern southern fronts, they were used as well. There's not quite as much material. There aren't quite as many authors that write about the eastern southern fronts, but they were very active, and I'll show you examples of those. Eventually, the Army discontinued operations. They felt that this was just too much investment for very small reward, and the losses were significant. They were losing aircraft, airships, and they were losing crews. So the Army took all the ships they had, they transferred them to the Navy. The Navy continued the operations for a while, and then the program ended in late 1917 and early 1918. So we've covered the entire operations in World War I for airships on one slide. Let's go back to this point about pre-war expectations. This is a postcard, a propaganda postcard. Oh, by the way, everything in these slides are in my collection. None of this is taken out of a book or somebody else's exhibit. So here's an expectation. Here's the emperor. shown in the center. On the left, you see the depiction of a submarine sinking a ship. This is the famous U-9. In one afternoon, the U-9 sank 3 British armored cruisers all by itself. Quite a feat. And here on the right-hand side, you can see a depiction of airships. These are of the Zeppelin type, bombing what appears to be a transportation center or a factory area. So this is a propaganda postcard, and there are many of these. Many people collect these, but it shows the thoughts of the citizens in Germany at that particular time. So those are citizen and patriot expectations. Let's look at military expectations. So we have the Army and the Navy, each one of them deciding how they're going to employ this new engine of war. This is a Navy depiction. So in the upper right, you can see a Zeppelin, and it's high above the fleet. The fleet's below. It's high enough so that it can see over the horizon, and it can see the enemy fleet. So the concept is that this airship becomes the eyes of the German admiral, where he can see the British formations, and he can muster his forces in a way to defeat the British Navy. In this particular depiction, just below them, you can see what looks like clouds in the top. Just below that are destroyers. Destroyers are like the cavalry of the Navy. They speed ahead to identify and find the German Navy. Behind them, you can see a second line that goes from left to right that's white and black. Those are the cruisers. The cruisers are like the Greyhounds. They run around, they're heavily armored, and they can take on any British ship except a great battleship. And then down below, with all the black smoke, and the names are in white below, these are the dreadnoughts of the German Navy. So the concept is that the destroyers lurch ahead, the cruisers come up behind them, and then the admiral uses the eyes of the Zeppelin to bring his battleships into combat with the British Navy. For the Army, it was very similar. As many of you know, the emphasis in the West, the war in France, was to wheel under the Schlieffen Plan, and it meant that those armies and corps closest to the Channel had to march very briskly. They were always on the roads and in the fields. The concept was that the Zeppelin would again hover above the airfield and move ahead of the armies as cavalry would, except they're in the air, to find the enemy and help the German generals find and defeat the British, the French, the Belgium, and of course later the US armies. That was the concept. As I mentioned earlier, because they were flying too low, that concept was entirely too costly to execute in the West. Okay, enough history. Let's shift back to philately and talk about how you might collect this most interesting material. You can collect by ship type and or number. The ships are all numbered, and the mail has cancels in a way that's very easy to figure out what ship number it is, and they're all in numerical sequence. You can collect the support organizations that had to launch these huge craft. They had company-sized troops of soldiers and sailors who marched the Zeppelin or the other 3 craft outside of the hangar and helped lift it into the air. And there are other organizations, I'll show you, schools and weather stations. There's crew mail. The crewmen aboard, a Zeppelin was usually commanded by the equivalent of an Army captain or a Navy lieutenant with a second command. It was usually a lieutenant, and 14 to 16 enlisted and some warrant officers. The crew members wrote gobs and gobs of postcards, some letters, it's mostly postcards. And they went through the post office and they're easy to identify. Every once in a while, if they were flying over a girlfriend's house, they might drop a postcard overboard. So there's some drop mail. It's not very common, but it can be found. It's fairly rare. I'll show you an example. There were seals used on these. They're adhesive. They look almost like stamps. And the seals after the war were collected very much in Germany just as a hobby. The seals can be collected used and unused. I'll show you an example. You can focus on the London Raiders and the Defenders and collect mail related to that. You can collect mail on the East, West, and Balkan fronts if you want. You could focus on propaganda mail. I'll show you some examples. When the war started, there were 5 airships that were in civil use. They were carrying passengers, not many, but carrying passengers, and they were converted to military use. The United States Air Force does exactly the same. It's called a craft fleet. The Civil Reserve Augmentation Fleet aircraft, U.S. commercial aircraft that are specially strengthened so they can be used in a war footing. Similarly, the German army took some of these civil airships and converted them to military use. And you can collect those. I'll show you examples. Human interest. This is my focus. There's really a lot of interesting writings. There's some great books, and some of these letters, excuse me, there are some surviving letters in some of the envelopes, but even the postcards and their cancels and what's written on them tell an amazing story of men at war. And these men were about the same age when they went to war as I was when I went into Vietnam. And the, the questions that we all have about how we're going to fit in, they had those same questions. You can collect balloons. There were thousands of observation balloons, and they're easy to identify. There are German reparations. At the end of the First World War, Germany was required to either turn over some aircraft or build some. In the case of the United States, they built one for us, the ZR-3. I'll show you examples of it. You can collect those. There's a military mail segment. These postcards and covers started out from a military commander putting his censor mark on it, and then they could go into the Army, the Feld Post, or the Shift Post for the Navy, or they could go into the civilian mail. I'll show you examples. There are gobs of resources. I'm going to show you some printed resources and give you some thoughts on Facebook sites. Okay, let's get going. So here are cancels. Here is on the left is a command cancel. It's commando. It's a cancel that indicates that the material, whatever it's on, has been censored and it's authorized to be dispatched by the commander. In this case, it says it's an envelope stamp. They put them on postcards also. And you can see over towards the right, it says Z11. So this is, by this, Z means it's a Zeppelin, and 11 means that it was the 11th one taken into the military. And more about that later, but this is pretty easy. It tells you, and the Z tells you that it's a Zeppelin, and we know that it's an Army aircraft, and it's number 11. Over here on the right is a Luftschiff troop. Luft, it means air, Schiff means ship, and troop means troop or company. And this is from number 15. And in the center of this one is the Prussian Eagle. These are very pretty. These are somewhat enlarged. They're about 35 millimeters, 37 millimeters in diameter, but most of them are this sharp. So here's another example. Over on the left, again, is a commando cancel. This is from an envelope. It says that it's a cancel for an envelope. This is from the Sachin, which is one of those commercial ships that was taken into the military, into the Army, commanded by an Army captain. Over on the right-hand side is a commando, again with a Prussian eagle in the center of it, and it's LZ 87. So the one on the left we identify by name, it also has a number, and the one on the right we identify by its number, LZ. LZ tells us it's an Army craft, and it's number 87 in the Army inventory. So here are some more examples. I mentioned Feldpost cancels. Many of these will have Feldpost, which means Army post cancels. In the United States Army, we call this an APO. And below, it's Feldpost number 209, and there are all kinds of lists and catalogs of where 209 was located. And then on the right-hand side is one of these seals. So this is like a stamp. It's got mucilage on the back. Lick it and put it on. Very attractive. Again, prominent is the Prussian seal inside. And the lettering on the outside says the Royal Prussian Airship Battalion number 4. And their list on where was number 4. And on this particular seal, they tell us, well, it was in Mannheim. The seal may or may not have been applied right there. The ships moved around a lot. So here's the key identity information. It's really pretty simple. All ships are airships. They're all Luftship of some kind of a type. There are 4 manufacturers. If it's manufactured by Zeppelin, it has 2 numbers. It has a production number, a workshop number that the Zeppelin factory used to keep track of their inventory. They then turned it over to the Army or the Navy, and it got a military designation. If it went to the German Army, it got a designation of either a Z or an LZ, nothing else. Everything in the Army is a Z or an LZ, no exceptions. If it's in the Navy, it's just an L, followed by the number in the Navy inventory. Again, no exceptions. Just a comment, sometimes I'll be at a show and a dealer will say, oh, here's a bunch of Zeppelin covers for you to look at. Many cancels say Luftschiff, but airship applies to the thousands of observation balloons that they use to direct their artillery. And so a Luftschiff, a balloon postcard is worth $4 or $5, €4 or €5, no more. So now let's talk about the types. So there are 4 types, and there are 4 distinct types of cancels. And this one is of the Zeppelin. So this is a standard looking Zeppelin. This is LZ102. That's the number that the factory put on it. When it went to the Navy, it got a new designation. It's L57. You can see this in the lower left. And this is what a Zeppelin looks like. It's almost in the United States, we compare it to a football field, but it's approaching 200 meters. It's cigar shaped in that it has a rounded nose, and then once you get to about a quarter back, it has the same diameter all the way until it necks down to the tail. So it's very much like a cigar. And you can, this is a postcard, and you can see that it was taken in 1917. That's when this ship was active. So we just looked at L57. Now here's some crew mail from L57. So here's L57, same ship we just looked at. In the lower left-hand side, you can see it has the commando, the sensor cancel issued under the authority of the commander. He didn't stamp all these himself. He's got a clerk that does this. But there's the number. It's very prominent. And most of these are really clear and easy to read. They must have taken a lot of care. And up above, you can see that this is from a guy named Merkel. I don't know exactly what he did on board, but he was a crewman on board. It's addressed to Marta Merkel, and Frau, it's Mrs. It's likely to be his wife, and there it went into the civilian system. It's got a civil mark from Friedrichshafen, so it went from the ship into the civil postal system. Friedrichshafen is where many of the Zeppelins were made. This is a particularly interesting cover because it's a turn cover. When you turn it over, because paper was hard to come by, the writer got a sheet of music and made an envelope out of it. I'm a musician. I play the cello. I'm particularly attracted to a folded cover made out of a piece of music. So I call this human interest. So here's LZ-97. Well, LZ, that means it's an Army craft. The last one's the Navy. This is Army. And up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see it's Commando. It's got a stamp for the commander. In the handwriting below, this is actually the commander, Linarts, and he says he's in Namur. This is a captured Belgium airfield. They're operating out of Germany now. And in the lower left-hand side, you can see Commando, LZ-97. Well, it's pretty clear that's the ship it came from. The marking at the very bottom, Hersatz, just says that it's Army material. And he says he's in Namur, and here's a stamp in the upper right from Namur, Belgium, a captured airfield, very active airfield. And this is interesting because this is sent to a Fraulein, and a lot of these commanders were young, and many of them didn't have wives yet. When we turn it over, the back is covered with the seals from this ship, and they're very attractive. And it only needs one to show that it's properly censored, and he put 5 on. Why would the commander of this ship writing to a Fraulein put all these on? Well, maybe that's his girlfriend, and he's trying to impress her.
There are more Virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss out.
More human interest. Now, if we depart from Zeppelin, there was a competitor to Zeppelin. And by the way, the Zeppelin factory made about 120 Zeppelins during and immediately after the First World War. They got up to Zeppelin 120. A competitor is Schutt Lanz, and they made a similar aircraft. You can see this looks like a Zeppelin. The only thing is it's more streamlined. The ship does not achieve its maximum diameter until about 3/5 the way down from right to left, down the ship's side, and it reaches a peak and then it tapers off. It's very gradual. It's more aerodynamically smooth. And there was only one manufacturer of engines at this time. If you put the same number of engines on a Schutt Lanz and you put the same size and number of engines on a Zeppelin, the Schutt Lanz would fly faster because it had better aerodynamic design. It's unusual in that the first ships were made out of laminated wood for lightness, and the later ships were made out of aluminum also, but it's an unusual type of construction. The interior looks very similar, almost identical to a Zeppelin. So here's a Schutt Lanz. So it doesn't have a Z, it has an SL because the manufacturer is different, and when it went into the military inventory, they designated it that way. So you can see in the upper left, it's SL Schutt Lanz, and it's number 13. This is pretty clear. And over on the right-hand side, you can see that it entered the German postal mail in Leipzig. Third type was a Parseval. A Parseval was more like a balloon. It didn't have a skeleton, and it didn't have a keel. It actually had 2 balloons inside. One was filled with air, the other with hydrogen, to give it this shape, a sausage shape. This is the This is Parseval number 6. There were many of these made, quite a few prior to World War I. But in the World War I itself, P4, Parseval number 4, was taken into the military inventory, so it was given a military censor stamp. And here's an example of it, again with a Prussian eagle. You can see in the upper left, is a cancel put on by the clerk on the ship. And on this side, on the right-hand side, it says Airship by authority of the commander, and underneath is P4. So it's a Parseval. Pretty easy to tell these apart. The last type is a Gross Bossenbach. There was only one of these ships, and they aren't quite as common. But this is what they looked like. They were a composite. They had a balloon above a rigid keel. So this is called a semi-rigid. So it was inflated above to provide the shape, and the keel on the bottom carried all of the weight. These are not quite as common. As a matter of fact, I only have one example in my collection, and this was designated an M, a militar, a military ship. I don't have any insight into why they used an M, but this is an example of it. This is actually not a piece of mail. This is an ID card. It's the only one I've been able to find and put into my collection, but it's signed by the commander. It's M4, and it's the fourth type of the 4 kinds of Zeppelins. Okay, let's depart from the types of ships and let's go to the types of support organizations. They had troops, which is a company size. They had battalions, which is about 800. Sometimes it's called a detachment. It's 800 soldiers or sailors. They had schools, and they're very easy to identify. Sometimes they had a base support unit, a Hafen. There were weather stations, and there are military construction battalions that went out and built these places. Here are some examples. So here's a Luftschiffe troop. This is the same one I showed earlier. So this is the troop that handles the airship getting in and out, and they provide maintenance and supply. This is troop number 15. On the other side, this is a shot of number 15. I think this is a comedy shot. This is not their regular transport. That poor little donkey couldn't carry all of these guys. I don't have the identities of the individuals, but by tradition, the fellow standing erect with the shiny boots, that's undoubtedly the commander, and the guy beside him is undoubtedly the XO. And you can see in there are a couple warrant officers, and the rest are enlisted men. So here's a detachment. This happens to be a Navy detachment. The red cancel, again, a nice strike. In just below the center, you can see that it's V5, Roman numeral 5, Marine. So this is a Navy detachment. And this is from Tonder, the Navy base that it was posted from. This is interesting. This is the other side. This is more human interest. So this sailor is sending this postcard to what looks to be it's to a Fraulein, it's probably his girlfriend. And below it says, I came, I saw, I conquered. In other words, that this lady came, saw, and conquered this sailor's heart, and the sailor's cap is above. The SMS indicates that it's a German World War I ship. So here's a battalion. This is what I showed earlier on the entire postcard. In the upper left, it's a airship battalion. It's number 4. It's from Mannheim. Here's a school or schule. This happens to be the commander of the school set up to train these troops that launch these ships. This is the seal itself. It's very pretty. I have an example of the regular ink cancel, but it's not in this slide set. So here's a weather station. It's a little hard to sea because the Mannheim cancel was put right on top of it. Weather stations are really important. These craft are so fragile that to be able to anticipate when large temperature changes are going to come through or weather, just a rainstorm can be a near catastrophe for a Zeppelin because it takes up so much water on the skin that it's carrying much more weight than it was originally intended. And so to keep the ship afloat, if it's sogged down with rainwater, you're going to have to dump something overboard. You're going to have to drop some bombs or throw a machine gun overboard or throw some food overboard, or in the most dire straits, you throw the radio overboard. Here's drop mail. This is quite difficult to find. You can see in the center is a rose vertical band and at the top it says 42. In front of it is an L. So this is a Navy ship, L-42, and it was dropped overboard. They often have the bearing Glück ab, which means good luck. I'm not sure why that was used. These are hard to find. If I find one of these at an auction, it's probably going to go for 1,000 euros, maybe much more. You can collect the London Raiders. Here's an example. This is from the commander, Peterson. He was a commander of L-12 and L-31. He actually perished in L-31. This is a letter to his wife, Frau Peterson, who was living in Berlin at the time. It doesn't have a ship cancel. The cancel in the upper right is of the support detachment. You can collect the Defenders. Here are the London Defenders with their arc lights. They were carbon arcs, probably. So they're out there with their generator behind them trying to identify Zeppelins, illuminate them so that artillery can shoot them down or their fragile airplanes can go attack them. Here's one from the Eastern Front. This is Kono, which is Kaunas, Lithuania, on one of our Baltic sea cruises. We visited there. And here again is the Prussian Eagle, and prominently displayed the name of the airbase. Here's the Balkan Front. This is L-59. This is a famous ship. It was specially lengthened to provide additional hydrogen storage on board. And it had no bombs. They took out the machine guns. They wanted to make it as light as possible because in Africa was a German army that was being besieged by the British, and they wanted some relief. They sent a cable to Berlin and said, please send us ammunition and medical supplies and cots. So they decided to send this airship all the way from Bulgaria to the end of Africa to resupply this crew, this army. This is a book written by the commander of the army. His name is below, Latak Vorpak, and this is the 40,000 kilometer Zeppelin war flight with the same ship we were just looking at. You can collect British propaganda. Here's a propaganda card showing the end. This is not a real photograph. It's a depiction labeled baby killers. Here's a very courageous airman, Lieutenant Robinson, who got the Victoria Cross for shooting down. He was the first British airman to shoot down a German Zeppelin. German propaganda. The Germans had an airship, the L-19, it's Navy, it's a Zeppelin, and it ran into engine difficulty and went down in the North Sea. And the crew survived the rough landing and were clinging to the sides of the ship. A British trawler came along, and the trawler captain had 2 seamen on board, and he looked at the 16 crewmen hanging on to the skin of the Zeppelin, and he was fearful that they would overpower him and take control of his trawler, so he turned around and steamed away. The Germans, when they learned of this, all of the crewmen perished. And when the German media learned of this, there was quite a howl that the trawler had left them to die. So here's a propaganda card on the event. Here's one where it's converted from civil to military use. This is the Hansa, one of these commercial ships. The strike in the center, very clear, says it's a Hansa, and it went into the civilian mail in Berlin. And here's one of these propaganda Cinderellas in the center, Gott strafe England, God will punish England. And that shows an airplane rather than a Zeppelin. So here's civil to military use and propaganda. On the other side is a photograph, and it says that this photograph was taken from this airship, and it's got the commander's stamp on the bottom of a gathering at one of their war memorials. More human interest. Post-World War I mentioned that German airships were transferred to the victors. And these are essentially military airships. That's the design they had. They went to the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. In the case of Great Britain, France, and Italy, they took ships they had on hand and flew them to their shores. In the case of the United States, they built one. They built the airship ZR3, and this is a cover of its flight, ZR3, flying from Friedrichshafen, where it was constructed, to the United States, where it was converted into a Navy craft and became Los Angeles. Okay, let's depart and talk about resources. These are general historical resources. Gott strafe England by Nigel Parker is probably the most complete. It covers almost all of the airships, regardless of manufacturer, and it covers Army and Navy airships. It's 3 volumes. It's about 700 pages, lots of good photographs. One of the standard texts is the one shown on the right by an American, Douglas Robinson. It's easier to read prose. It's a little smaller. It's about half the length of Parker's book. The prose is a little easier to read, and it's got great spreadsheets in it that are really easy to use to discover what your ship might have been doing. The best single source is this book. I'm working in English now. Is Zeppelin by Greel and Joachim. Greel and Dressler. And this covers every ship. This is the first book I go to because inside it has extensive listings. This is too small for anybody to read, but the columns down the left-hand side start with the manufacturer's number. The second column is the military inventory number, and then it tells when the ship was constructed, when it was turned over, who the commanders were, and the small type on the right-hand side tells you the fate of that ship, how many bombing missions it went on, how many recon missions it went on, or if it was lost to weather or enemy fire. There are philatelic sources. Mikkel, I think, is the best in this particular area. It's German. It's published in German and French, and from time to time in English. I believe this is the last one in English that I have. It's 2003. But you can see there on the right-hand side in the white at the fourth entry is synopsis of air and naval airships. And so there's a whole list, and the two above them list many of the military ships, all the way from LZ-1 all the way to LZ-114. And it even covers LZ-126, which is the Los Angeles we just spoke of. This is a good source. The standard source for most of us was Zeppelin Fever. is the Seeger, and it's really not quite as complete in the wartime. However, and it's published only in German, but here's the index from the edition I have, which I think is the last one. And you can see there under 3.0, it covers war airships, Kriegsluftschiff, from 396 all the way to 435. There are lots of entries. And 3.1 covers Army ships, and 3.2 covers Marine ships. And both of these catalogs provide some samples of the cancels. The ultimate Bible is really this book by Jürgen Snevogt. It's in German, but I can translate most of it even myself. He has 5 volumes, and inside are shown these cancels that I just discussed. It identifies when they were used, if they were a seal, if they're a cancel, even provides a relative rating of price. There are Facebook resources. Cheryl Gantz runs a great one, Zeppelin and Airship Collectors, Stamps, Mail, and Ephemera. I post there often. Alistair Reed, who's in Norway, I believe, runs, these are private, runs the airship dirigibles and blimps. He's also a noted author. Cheryl Gantz has authored or co-authored 3 books. Alistair probably has 10 books, and he does a lot of translating. Ray Reynolds has a Zeppelin group under his name. You can search for any of these and ask the administrator that you can be admitted. Ray Reynolds has written, he's a noted author also. He writes mostly on the English side and probably has 12 or 15 books. Want to give you an idea of the cost of material. The seals, Feldpost cards, and propaganda cards are the price of a going to McDonald's to get a fast food breakfast. The pieces with the support unit castles are maybe an evening meal at a chain restaurant. The Commando numbered ship cancels that have got clear cancels and you can tie to crew members. Maybe that's a nice restaurant meal for 2. Drop mail, that's 3 nights in a Sheraton hotel. And I try to buy these in lots where a collector is disposing of multiple pages or multiple holdings, and they're much cheaper that way. Sources, I use Philasearch to search for material. The auction houses I'm most commonly bidding in are Felsman, Palmer, and Siegel. There's some on eBay, both in the US and in Germany. I find them to be overpriced. I have a couple German dealers that look for material for me, and dealers at some US shows have them, but I find them to be overpriced also. So if you're a Blazing Saddles fan like I am, this is a vamp. This saloon singer is a vamp on Marlene Dietrich, who is the niece of Max Dietrich. Marlene had a successful career in Germany, then fled to America, where she had a very successful second career. Her uncle was a commander of L7, L18, L21, and he perished in the shoot down of L35 over England. If you want to be like Marty McFly and go back to the future, here's a sample. This is a cover sent by Dr. Hugo Echner to his wife. Hugo Echner is the architect of the great commercial Zeppelins after the war. At this particular time, he's in the middle of the war as a civilian instructor, teaching young soldiers and sailors how to steer these monsters. Here's LZ-120, Ernst Lehmann, commander of both the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg. This is to his girlfriend, who later became his wife, and you can see the very clear cancel from LZ-120. Upcoming things in 2025 at Chicago PEX, the Military Postal History Society is convening. I'll give a program there. I hope to have an exhibit 2026, Boston International. The German Philatelic Society will run a joint salon with their German partners, and there'll be a lot of focus on international cooperation. Okay, so at the speed of light, or warp drive, as Scotty would say to Captain Kirk, we've summarized this interesting segment of World War I philatelic history and shared some ideas on methods of collecting. If you have any comments, questions, or more importantly, covers to share, here's my contact information. I welcome your communications.
We hope to see you at our next Stampex show, at Virtual Stampex or in person in London. There are more Virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. You know what to do. Click subscribe now so you don't miss out. See you soon.